Good morning. My name is Corey Parks. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the project coordinator here. So this next session that we're going to have is how data shapes community development efforts. And with our panelists in the hallway before we started, I was joking about how data is always a difficult session to have, but hopefully this will be a little bit more interactive, and so you'll get some good takeaways and be able to ask some questions. As far as the layout for what this session will involve, each panelist is going to have 5 minutes to kind of give some opening remarks, and then from there I'll ask some prepared questions, and then you will also have the opportunity to ask questions as well. If at any point you decide you want to ask questions because you're tired of hearing my questions, feel free to do so. I've got a list of probably 8, but I've already explained to them that I can ask them, but if after the first couple, 2 or 3, then if you all want to open it up and ask your own questions, that's fine as well. So with that, we'll get started. Is that okay with everyone as far as the layout? Good, yes, no? Hopefully y'all are continue to be as interactive as y'all were this morning. So introducing our panelists, we have Terry McClendon, who is Senior Research Coordinator at the Arkansas Economic Development Institute. We have Sarah Kinzer, who is the Chief Program Officer at the Arkansas Community Foundation. And then Jacob Bundrick, who is a Policy Analyst at the Arkansas Center for Research and Economics. So if we want to start, I don't know who wants to take the lead as far as if we want to start left to right or right to left, but feel free to give your overview or opening remark.
All right, I guess I'll kick it off. So as Corey said, my name is Jacob Bundrick. I'm a policy analyst with the Arkansas Center for Research and Economics, or ACRE for short. We're a university-based research center that's housed just across the street in UCA's College of Business. We perform academic research with the goal of educating the public on important public policy issues right here in Arkansas. So we focus our research on a few different economics issues, things like taxation, governmental transparency, K-12 education, property rights, things of that nature. I was asked to come out and visit with you all today because my work focuses on economic development policy. Specifically, I research the effects of targeted economic development incentives. So I don't know if you all are familiar with that terminology or not, but it's things like tax breaks and subsidies that are given to individual companies with the hopes of attracting more business investment and growing the economy in a local jurisdiction, or a state for that matter. So over the last few years, if my research hasn't taught me anything else, it's taught me that public officials and policymakers have a lot of decisions to make with respect to economic development. Some of those decisions are really, really big, like what should the overall tax system look like within the state or the municipality. There's workforce issues that have to be thought through. There's infrastructure issues that have to be thought through. So these are some really big issues, right? And there's also these more narrowly focused questions, like what I focus my work on. And that's things like, should an economic development strategy involve the use of these incentives, these targeted tax breaks and subsidies? Some governments already engage in that, and there's actually quite a few governments that engage in it, so they have other decisions to make, like what types of incentives they should use, right? There's a bevy of them out there between tax credits and tax exemptions, refunds, or cash grants, or low interest loans, right? They have to think about what types of companies they're going to incentivize, what industries they're going to chase after. They have to think about what types of economic activities they want to incentivize, whether it's job creation or investment, things like that. So there's all these questions that policymakers and public officials have to think about. And that brings up, an even more important question. That's, how do you make these decisions, right? There's all these decisions you have to make. How do you make them? Well, at ACRE, what we contend is that those decisions should be made with data, right? You should rely on data to make these decisions because that's the most reliable way to make the best public policy decisions out there, right? Most of these economic development policies are put into place to achieve a certain goal, right? With data, we can analyze those policies and those programs to see if they're actually achieving that goal. We can use data to analyze whether the benefits of a specific economic development policy or program outweigh the costs of that program. We can use data to analyze whether certain policies or programs are more effective in some situations or under certain circumstances, but maybe they're less effective under other circumstances or situations. We can use data to analyze whether these policies and programs have unintended consequences. So maybe we institute a policy to achieve one goal, but there's actually these spillover effects that it's a different result that we get, and maybe it's a good thing, right, and makes the policy more desirable, but maybe it's a bad thing and it makes it less desirable. We can analyze that sort of thing with data, right? So just to kind of sum it up, we can use data to analyze policies, right, so that we make sure we're instituting the best public policies possible. And we can also use it to identify and correct any misguided policies, because these policy decisions that are being made at the state level, the local level, the federal level, right, they have real consequences for real people, right? These decisions affect the livelihoods of everyone living and working in Arkansas, so it's important that we're making sure we're making the best policy decisions. So I appreciate you all having me out here, and I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you. Gosh, that was really interesting. I want to pick your brain about what you do now. So I work at Arkansas Community Foundation, which is a nonprofit grant-making organization. So like the Walton Foundation, the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, we make grants to other nonprofits to support the work that they do. But we are different from those other private foundations in that we are funded by a variety of people, institutions, families, organizations across the state. So we're sort of a grassroots grant maker. We've got 28 local offices across the state, each with their own local grant making pool, funds raised from that community and intended to be permanently invested and granted back out to the community to meet the changing needs across time. So I'm here today because of an informational report that we put together starting in 2011, and this is the most recent edition from 2013, called Aspire Arkansas. So our interest in data began as we started to think through, because we're a very general purpose grant maker and support a wide variety of charitable causes, how can we be more focused in using our resources to make the most good in the community? When you have all of that flexibility, it's great because different communities need different things, and what Marianna, Arkansas needs is a lot different than what Fayetteville, Arkansas needs. But because of all of that flexibility, sometimes we see that impact can be a bit scattershot. And so our intent was to look at data to try to have a better understanding of what does a particular community need at this time, where are the challenges and opportunities, so that we can try to help connect our resources to folks who are working on those issues. So we started producing Aspire in 2011, as I said, actually in partnership with Terry's organization, the UALR Institute for Economic Advancement. So we wanted the data. They had the means to pull it all together and put it into a really cool report for us that's based around health, education, families, which is sort of economic indicators, and then communities, which is civic engagement indicators. So in our report, and I have copies of this for y'all, you can see that we can look at, within the education pillar, graduation rates by school district, remediation rates by county. Within the health pillar, we can look at prenatal care rates or activity rates, obesity rates, smoking rates. Having all of that information and then broken down in a map that shows you county by county where things stand is intended to kind of help give a better sense of, well, what's this county doing that is succeeding that this county could learn from? Or if our county is doing really well in one area but not as well in another, why? And so I liked your format. What I have learned from doing this work is that having data does not in any way mean that things will change. So to temper your expectations, it's sort of like having that fitness tracker on your wrist. Just knowing that I only took 3,000 steps today does not change that fact, and it does not make me get to 10,000 steps today, although I very much should. Data can kind of serve as a wake-up call. Sarah, why are you only walking 3,000 steps a day? Or, Monroe County, what is happening with your infant mortality rates? It can serve as a rallying point where folks are coming together and saying, that number is unacceptable, we need to change it. And it can even serve as a success barometer or accountability measure where people come back together over time and have a commitment to seeing their numbers move in the right direction. But I think the human element is really important in the use of data for community development and for all of the sort of community-based work that we may want to do, because data can't necessarily tell you what interventions are necessary are going to work within your specific community unless you dig in and ask more questions, look for more research, talk to more people. And then it can't necessarily get people to take action. So my background is in public relations, and I think there is a healthy relationship between what do the numbers tell us and then what does our community say, and how can we get our community to embrace those numbers and work together to move them in the right direction. That is really hard work, and we are still learning about it, but I think it's fascinating and worthwhile. So that's where we're at.
Boy, those are two good stories. And I'm reminded of, and I wish I'd brought the quote, I have a quote on the bottom of my emails that reminds me that data's great, but what really helps you more than anything else is the ability to tell a story. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what you want to try to do with data. To back up just a little bit, as Corey mentioned, I'm Terry McClendon. We've changed our name just in the last 2 months. No. I've been with the university since 1979 with this organization, and I'm having more trouble than anybody remembering what our new name is. We are now the Arkansas Economic Development Institute at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And we have a variety of services available to people. We have a GIS laboratory. We have probably one of the most important resources we've got is the Census Data Center, the Arkansas Census Data Center, which means that we're the go-between between the state of Arkansas and the Census Bureau. We get census publications before anybody else does, and we work with them throughout the 10-year period between censuses to help make the data in Arkansas as good as possible. We also have economists that do forecasts of the state's economy and forecasts of sub-state regional areas that also do economic impact analysis, which is something else that a lot of you may encounter or want to pursue. We also provide facilitation services and a variety of different research and technical assistance services around the state. Let me just tell you a little bit about why we exist. Historically, we were formed by the University of Arkansas, which was just the campus at Fayetteville back in the 1940s. In 1955, when the legislature formed what is now AEDC, the Arkansas Economic Development Commission, they appointed us to be their research arm, because the thought was that university faculty and staff had more of an ability to perform the research needed than anybody else in the state did at the time. That's not quite the case today, but we still exist partly due to some state funding, partly because of some federal funding that we get from the Economic Development Administration to be a university center for the same purpose, and a lot because of other grants and contracts that we have. And we try to be the supporting staff for economic and community development across the state. Now, I'd like to talk just a couple of minutes about what exactly data is, because I think we've gotten to a point in the country where there's a lot of confusion and distrust of data. First of all, data is not necessarily all numbers. You can have data that's collected that involves quotes from different people, and you may have this kind of data if you do a survey in your community, or if you have community meetings, town hall meetings. Although most data is numbers, it's not all numbers. Secondly, we talk about, data experts talk about two different kinds of data based on the type of collection effort there is. Primary data is data that you go out and you collect yourself. Like you take a survey, you ask people questions and get their responses. That's primary data. Secondary data is data that's been published someplace. And like the census data is secondary data because the Census Bureau went out and did the surveys, and they have come back and published this for us. Most of the time, you're going to find that when you're dealing with an organization like ours, we're going to be limited to providing you with something that's already been published, because taking a survey for us, doing a survey, is rather costly to do. If you want to do a survey, the best way to do it is to work with some of the professionals on getting help with designing the survey, designing the questionnaire that you're going to use, and then you can administer it, and we can even help with analyzing the survey. Back when I started, back in the 70s and in the 80s, most data that was available was not available to the general public. And so there was a limitation of the amount of data that people had. Now we've kind of come to the opposite of that, where people are being inundated with data all the time from tons of different sources. The problem now is not so much getting data, the problem is deciding which is the good data and how to use that data. And one of the biggest issues I see with clients I work with around the state is data misinterpretation, because you're not using the right data set for what you're trying to do. And there are a lot of little ticky things you have to pay attention to on that. There has been a further issue with this, with a lot of software programs that are available for people to use now to, for example, do their own economic impact analysis. But depending on the accuracy level you want of it, you may find that those things are kind of dangerous in the wrong hands, because there are a lot of things that can influence the results of that. So that's the kind of help that we try to provide to people. In addition to publishing research that we perform, we also do consultations with different people around the state, and we're always ready to help people who have data of one kind or another and would like a kind of an outside look at whether that's good data to use and how to best use it. How's that?
That's good. Thank you all for your opening remarks. So Sarah, I'll pick on you for the first question, because your opening statement kind of is a good segue. So you mentioned that you all have worked with Terry's office to collect data for your ACRE report, but what other ways does your organization, what other resources does your organization use to collect data?
Yeah, so for us, when we're looking at what are the needs in our communities, so we use secondary data. Obviously, the ACRE report is all secondary data, so we're pulling from a variety of different sources. Most of the information in this report comes from the census, the Arkansas Department of Health, the Department of Education, and then some community indicator sources. There's a Bureau of Labor Statistics survey that tracks information on people's feelings of civic engagement and how connected they feel to their communities, and so we're going to be using more of that. So I think resources like Terry's organization and others out there that are good at pulling all of that together and slicing and dicing it and preparing it in a way that you have a dashboard and not just a giant Excel spreadsheet is really useful for community engagement work. I think for us, your point about data is not just numbers is really resonating with me right now. A lot of our strategy of working through our affiliate system and having offices in 28 different communities is that community feedback is a huge component of where our grants go. So having people who are living in each of the communities where we're working is important to have a sense of what the needs are there that we wouldn't be able to get sitting in an office in Little Rock. So there's definitely a lot of qualitative, what are the needs you're observing in your community, what are the conversations that are happening in your community. We are trying to do more with outcomes reporting with the grants that we make. How many of y'all have applied for any sort of a grant before, a federal grant? Okay, so those onerous reports that you have to turn in, right? I have completed a number of those myself. But I think there's a big movement in philanthropy right now to not make our reports so much about what did you do with our money and did you do what you said you were going to do, but more to collect the learnings that your organization is experiencing on the ground. What worked and what didn't, and how can we take those success stories and do more of that? How can we troubleshoot what didn't work and address that to make your project more successful in the future? So our organization is a little bit behind the curve on getting good at collecting grant reporting and synthesizing that, but we're trying to do more with data with our grantees in a way that supports the work that our grantees are doing and amplifies the learnings from their programs. So lots of places.
And then can you answer that same question, Jacob?
Yeah, so we're more or less consumers of data, this secondary data. The way that we operate is we engage in academic research. So we're gonna go out and see what problems there are in the public policy realm with Arkansas. We're gonna look at the existing literature that's out there. So I don't know if any of you all use Google Scholar at all. Is that right? That's kind of what I figured. So that's one of the academics that are into that sort of thing. So we'll go out there and see if we have a question about, do job creation tax credits actually create jobs, right? We'll go in and see what other academics around the world have found in their research, right? And then from that, we'll decide, hey, here's a direction, here's a way that we can answer this question a little bit better than they can, right? And so we'll go out and we'll get data from the census or the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We'll dig through the state's reports about how they issue incentives, what types of incentives they're issuing. Now that data is somewhat limited in its current form, but we'll take that, and then through that we'll use our economics training. A lot of our people in our shop have PhDs in economics, so we're using the most rigorous statistical techniques that we can with regards to regression analysis and things like that. So we'll write up our results and then we'll send it out to academic journals, and it'll go through this double-blind peer review process and then hopefully be published. So in that peer review process, they're looking for holes in the types of data that we're using. They're looking for holes in any assumptions that we've made. They're looking for holes in how we've interpreted things or whether there's a better model to use, right? And then when that gets published, what we do is, since we realize that most of the time it's only academics reading that type of work, we try to distill it into more digestible products, right? So we get rid of the jargon, we make it much shorter, we get rid of the the modeling and the specific mathematics behind all of that, so that we can take the data that we've consumed and give it to other people in the community, whether that be voters or people at the local level that are making these decisions at the local level, or state legislators, so that they can see what's out there, what academics have to say about these certain issues, and make decisions based on that. So I hope that answered what you're looking for. So.
And then on a similar note, Terry, since you all serve as kind of the intermediary between communities and various organizations to provide that data, can you talk about the different ways that communities, in addition to the Arkansas Economic Development Institute, the different ways that communities can access data and how they can get that so they can use that in their communities, focusing more on the community level than the organizational level?
Sure. Let me mention one way that's coming in the next few months through the AEDI to access data is a brand new dashboard of data about Arkansas that we're going to be publishing, and we're in the process of putting that together. It's going to be very comprehensive, believe me, but it will have a bent toward economic development because our work does focus more on the economic development side than the community development side. However, let me mention that I totally agree with Rhonda about there's a symbiotic relationship. It's kind of like the old Frank Sinatra song, Love and Marriage. You know, you can't have one without the other. But as far as other data sources, I would say that the most trustworthy data source that you can go to for any type of statistic is a government data source, federal government first, and along with the Department of Commerce sources. Jacob mentioned the economic data sources as Department of Labor, BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau has an interactive website that has the most recent up-to-date data about your communities available to you. I find it actually a little bit intimidating to go through and sometimes confusing to go through. So again, you know, you might find that information elsewhere distilled down, as Jacob mentioned too. That's one of the things that we do as well. Another set of sources might include, on the federal level, you can also look for, like, Department of Education has some data available on education. The CDC has health information, including vital statistics. So if you're looking for births and deaths in your area, that's a place to look at it. State government agencies are another source of data. Discover Arkansas is a website that's put together by our, what do they call it now? In employment security, what do they call employment now? I can't remember. Everybody keeps changing their names, I'll tell you.
Okay,
but I
hard to keep
do
up
know
with.
their website is called Discover Arkansas. And you can get information on the workforce. Oh, workforce
Workforce
services.
services, yeah,
That's
Department
it.
of
Oh, we
Workforce
all went
Services.
blank.
Yeah,
Huh? Yeah, that's what happens. So, and then I would, after you look at state sources and local sources in some cases, after you look at government sources, then I would look at academic sources, as Jacob mentioned. Academic sources are called peer-reviewed sources, and they go through a lot of vetting. You can pretty much trust most of the big-name university sources. If you see something that comes from a university you've never heard of, try to do some further checking. And one of my rules, it used to be when we were doing research before the internet came along, we'd look for at least 3 to 5 sources of information that were in agreement on what they were saying. The things that you need to watch out for are things like the point of view of the author. I recently did a study on marijuana use in different states where it's been legalized and the effects that it's had on things like crime, education, taxes, economic impact, housing, a lot of socioeconomic indicators. And it was one of the hardest things I ever did because most of the sources I was finding were coming from groups that were either very much opposed to legalization or very much in favor of legalization. And if they've got a particular point of view, I can't trust their information to be objective. They may have something that's absolutely right, but their point of view could taint what they're doing. So government sources first. Mainstream press is something that you can get behind. You may not agree with their editorial point of view. And by mainstream press, I'm talking about major newspapers in the country, like the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, newspapers from big cities. I'm also talking about news organizations like CNN, CBS, ABC, NBC, NPR, PBS, things that have been around a long time, because there are very strict rules for journalists, for quality journalists for these organizations. So don't be as afraid of these organizations as a lot of special interest groups would make you think you should be afraid. But again, check what you've got, look for more than one source that says the same thing. How's that?
If I can jump in on that, like with the academic sources, if there's some indices or something like that they're creating, there's kind of two ways that you can look at how reputable it is. One is, do other academics use it, and have they published with it, right? If no one's published with it, there's a reason for that. But if lots of people are publishing with it in a variety of journals from different universities, it's probably going to be pretty solid. The second thing is, are they open with their methodology for how they create it, right?
Absolutely.
If they're not very transparent in it, there's a reason for that. If they're very transparent, they're not trying to hide anything, right? So you can see it, and then you can make that judgment for yourself whether you agree with the methodology or you disagree with it. So just kind of two tips for looking into that if you're trying to check on those sorts of sources.
I see a hand, so at this time we'll open it up to the floor for audience questions.
Okay, so one of the questions I have, I guess, for any of you, I actually work with secondary data from the government as part of my research. The government is very good at aggregating and hiding the data that they're looking for in terms of what it is that they're aiming to say. So when we're working from INT, they're also very good at not providing the raw data in accessible forms in terms of doing your own data analysis. And the problem with how they aggregate some of this information is that it hides a lot of what we need to know about how subgroups are affected or minority groups are affected in terms of policy decisions that we're making. So how is it that you take your secondary data that you're using to create policy? Because we do know that for the most part, policy is created by numerical data. It is not generally created by qualitative analysis. So how are you taking this information that actually does a fairly good job at hiding a lot of community needs and parsing that out so that it is in fact addressing not just part of the community, but the entirety?
Right. So that's a good point, and I think a lot of it too depends on what level of data you're looking at. So for us, we sometimes run into problems with like city level data or county level data, because a lot of that is estimated, and it's like we use a source. I'm going blank on what it's called right now. It's the SAPE data set, small area income and poverty estimates, right? And a lot of that's estimated, and so they're following trends. So you have to be careful about that. And in some ways, it's a difficult question because the alternative data sets are maybe non-existent, right? But for what we do is we internally kind of vet through that data set. They publish their methodology about how they do things, and we determine whether we think that's a viable data set or not. And if it's not, it might just mean for us that we can't do that type of project. It might be that we have to go to a higher level, where you get better data at state level, you get even better level or data at the country level.
And see, I work with federal level data.
Yeah.
And like I said, they aggregate it in very specific ways.
Right.
That make it difficult to parse out who's actually being affected
Right.
and at what level.
So sometimes what we'll do is, usually in our analysis, we'll have a limitations to the analysis, right? And so we disclose that kind of thing, meaning that when we do an analysis, there's certain cautionary statements about it, like we can make this much, we can use this analysis and this result to tell us this much about this specific issue, but we need to be mindful that, hey, here's this problem with the data set, or there's certain things that, like when we're analyzing economic development incentives, right, one of the problems is you never really know if that company would have located in Arkansas without that incentive, right? Well, that's a hard thing to say, right? So we can either assume that all of them would have come here without that incentive, or we can assume that none of them would have come here without the incentive. We can never really ascertain that. So that's one of the challenges that we have to work through, and just understand the limitations in the analysis that we're actually doing. So,
Would you mind telling me which kind of data you're having problems with?
I work with FBI data.
Oh, FBI?
I work
Okay.
with the Uniform Crime Reporting Database.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
The National Incident Reporting Database.
Good luck.
Yeah.
yeah, I don't.
I'm really good at hiding what it is that is going on.
Yeah,
Crime data
Well,
is very
it's-
difficult.
Crime data is also difficult because depending on what you're trying to find, every jurisdiction has its own set of crimes. So things may be called by different names in different jurisdictions. Things are, and I'm trying to figure out what the crime rate is in Little Rock, North Little Rock, and other areas of Pulaski County is even difficult.
Right.
Going across more borders than that is even worse.
Well, they've actually uniformed.
Right, I know. I've worked with FBI data, yeah.
So I agree with Dr. Collier in regards to, we have an issue with variable construction and data dictionaries. But my question is about the AEI. So you said there's going to be a dashboard. That data is going to be aggregated and presented at what level? Will it be?
Okay, it depends on the particular data set. For example, I was working on some data related to occupational statistics. And occupational statistics, I was able to compare the different MSAs in Arkansas with the state as a whole. We compared Arkansas versus the US. Some other people working with other data are like some of the census data, you can go to every county. But as I think Jacob mentioned, if you go below a county level, it gets really tough to find good data. And let me mention before I forget, the census is under threat. It has been for the last 20 years. I have watched the amount of data coming out of the census get less and less and less since 1980. And it's really starting to impact the states like Arkansas because Jacob mentioned error rates. In some counties in Arkansas, their error rate is something like 50%. Because they survey so few people in the state, or in the rural counties.
Right.
They're doing away with a lot of data and a lot of surveying because they aren't getting the money they need. And the 2020 census is on track to be even worse. And don't think that you're going to go to other sources of data like private databases, because every private database that you can look at is based on census data. Every single one of them. They massage them different ways, but they're all based on that. So that's something you need to, if data's important to you, you need to contact your congressional representatives about that.
So
Yeah.
it's,
Sorry.
can I finish quickly?
Yes, quickly. Sorry.
Because there is the limitation that we kind of get to that county level and we lose quality. But we're talking about community development, which typically occurs within communities within a county.
Or neighborhoods.
Right, and
yeah.
so it's that zip code level data that we really need. So is there a way to partner with industry like Deloitte has these massive data sets at an individual level, but it seems like government and industry doesn't really want to interface and create a data warehouse?
So I've heard of a model that might be of interest to you. The Community Foundation in Memphis put together an indicator site similar to Aspire Arkansas, but their intent was to make it more of an open data platform that other entities could feed data sets into. At least that's my understanding. So they're working down to the census tract within the Memphis MSA, and I think they've partnered with the University of Memphis, University somewhere in Tennessee, I can't recall, to build a data platform. And then it is my understanding, I hope I'm not misstating this, that like if you are working on a project to count the number of streetlights per block, you can feed that data set in. Or if you're working on environmental quality by neighborhood, you can feed that data in, and then it can be mapped. So the project is called wherewelivemidsouth.org. I don't know that it is fully accomplishing exactly what you're talking about, but I think that idea of a community sharing a platform in that way is kind of interesting, and I think that's where they are intending to go.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back.
Terry, you mentioned at the start that you want your data to tell a story, and then you just mentioned that you massage the data. My struggle is how do you deal with community leaders that, despite all the data that you present, doesn't tell the story that they want to tell?
Yeah.
I've
a
heard
problem.
from consultants that I know that this is getting to be a bigger and bigger and bigger problem. And quite frankly, I don't know how to counteract the anti-scientific attitude that seems to be taking hold in this country. The only thing I could say, the only thing I would say to an elected official is, if you want to believe what you want, I can't stop you. But I want you to know this could result in something very different than what you think. If you act on this, you're going to have very different results than what you think. One of the things that we used to do on publications is we would have a little disclaimer in there saying, if you decide to use our data in the wrong way and you quote us in error, we have the right to go out to the press and say, that's not what we said.
Right.
And so that's something that you can sometimes use. But I think everybody in the country is struggling with that.
Yeah.
Sarah?
One thing that comes to my mind, I don't know that this is the full answer to the question, but I think sometimes with community level work, there's the opportunity to go and see and experience. And I think sometimes you think you know what the story of your community is, but then maybe you're just accustomed to your own experience within that community. And I've been really struck lately by a couple of site visits that I've gone on with different groups to go and see and experience, and just how that reinforces what the data says, but it also helps me have that picture in my head, that personal touch that pulls at my heart and says, no, I know this is important because I saw it with my own two eyes. So I think, Terry's point is so important. The story is what makes people act on data.
Right.
So I do think there may be a place to take people to go and see and get out of their normal daily flow to help make the numbers make more sense. I don't know that that will convince everyone, but there may be some folks who would be willing to hear once they've experienced.
My concern is that you're talking about a group of people that are open, and one of our other classes we're taking is a discussion of openness, and open to being informed on what those other perspectives are versus reinforcing the bias that we hold ourselves. And that's what I'm trying to figure out in terms of, because we haven't used the word too much this morning, but community really is about politics. And that's what we have to figure out, is how do we overcome that inertia when that inertia is resistant to everything that we're trying to do to inform our community in order to improve.
I know that one of the things that happens at CDI every year, and I've seen it used elsewhere, that's very effective at taking people out of their own minds, like what you were talking about, is a poverty simulation, going through a poverty simulation, when you're talking about teaching people what it's like to be on the other side, to be experiencing poverty every day. So when people go through this simulation, you would be amazed at what happens. The important part of it is not the simulation itself, where people are playing the role of somebody else. The important part is afterwards, during the debrief, and you would not believe the kinds of insight that people suddenly have, like, oh my gosh, our state offices and county and city offices that help people in these positions need to be open on Saturdays or need to be open in the evenings so that people have a chance to get there so they don't have to take time off work. There are all kinds of ways like that, simulations that can help people get out of their own mindset. Mark Peterson, one of the things that he does is he takes people on bus trips various places, and that's another way to get out of your mindset. But you really have to try to get people, to provide people with some really startling insight or change in order to get them to change their minds. It's very hard. My background's in economics and marketing, and any marketer will tell you it's much harder to change an existing attitude than to create a new one.
Right.
So.
That's why they don't rebrand a whole lot.
Yeah,
Because
exactly,
It's difficult.
exactly.
So.
Thank you all. I'm loving the dialogue. Question here.
My question, I guess, isn't as in-depth or as high up as the past question was again, but I'm not sure how to word it. Let me explain to you what our issue is with grants. We find with our organization that people are wanting to put money directly to donation and grants, both directly to our initiative, directly to our academy, directly to our garden. The problem we've been having is staff payments. You know, everyone expects the staff to work for free and volunteer, but with the amount of effort that it takes to put into the organization to accomplish what we want to accomplish, that's just not possible. One of the major impacts that this has had is in our academy. Our teachers, a lot of them will work a day job during the day, either teaching or working at Chick-fil-A, like our director last year did, and work our academy in the afternoons after school, and they can only manage to last about a year doing that. And then we have to get a new director, which then creates this problem within the community because these kids are used to not having consistency and they need this consistency. So these people coming in, winning their trust, and then leaving is creating a situation where the kids are not wanting to come back. It's hard to get them back the next semester when we have a new director. My daughter, who is one of our biggest volunteers, you know, than more than anyone else, working with the academy, actually quit her entire semester because of it. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my question is, what kind of data, what kind of information should we be putting out there to try to fix this? Because when we do try to mention it in grants, you know, we need staff payment, people want to shut us down. They don't want to hear, you want to pay people. They want to hear how you're helping people, and not getting that connection that we have to have one or we can't have the other.
I would say it depends on, well, first question is, it depends on the size of the grant that you're going for and the entity to which you're applying. So, for example, if I know I've only got $1,000 to grant, sending that towards a staff payment is difficult because then I think, oh gosh, well, that's not very sustainable. That's not going to get you to a full salary. That's just going to mean that you need that again next year. So that money might be better used for something else. If it's a larger entity that's willing to make a larger investment, then I think that that can make sense. And there's definitely a growing awareness among funders that general operating support of the kind you're talking about is necessary to build more sustainable nonprofits, as long as that's done in partnership with, okay, what is your strategic plan? What is your fundraising plan? And how can we resource you to grow so that we don't create a dependence where you will never be able to survive without that specific funding source for that staff member? I think foundations really worry about wanting to help, but then also if we give you a grant to fund a salary position and then need to shift that grant to another purpose in the future, you've hired someone who now you're going to have to fire, and there's that fear of doing that because real lives hang in the balance. So I'm very sympathetic to that question because you have to have people to do the programs. I think things like your turnover rate, a business leader is going to understand why that's a problem. So I think that's an important data point that you can use in fundraising for general operating support. I think a business leader is going to understand the return on investment for what you invest in marketing, what you invest in your organizational capacity. And so framing it around, we have to do these things in order to implement the program more successfully. Not just the casual donor off the street may necessarily relate to that, but I think a person who really is deeply invested in your organization might be willing to hear that when you frame it around return on investment and capacity building for future sustainability. I'd love to talk with you more about that later on. I think that's such a really interesting situation that a lot of nonprofits are in.
The other thing that I might suggest very quickly is look at your board of directors. Do you have someone who is a financial analyst or a financial advisor on your board? I know that my son has ended up, he's a financial analyst for a company that works with business finance, and he's ended up on a couple of nonprofit boards primarily because of his financial expertise, and he helps them get over that hump. So
I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry, I saw your hand first, but I'll skip over you because I saw a new hand in the back.
I just have a quick question for Sarah. The SPIRE report?
Yes.
How is that distributed and who typically uses it?
Good question. So it hasn't been actively distributed in a while because the most recent edition came out in 2013, so our data is old, but we're about to release the next edition in early 2018, and it's going to be online, so you'll be able to get to it from anywhere, kind of dashboard style. Our typical audiences, first and foremost, are our donors within the community foundation, and then our affiliate board members and staff who are making funding decisions within their service areas. But then also we hear from a lot of nonprofits who find the data really helpful to have all in one place when they're writing grant proposals. We hear from community leaders and elected officials that it's helpful to have kind of a dashboard right there at hand. So our target market for Aspire is both internal, informing our own grant making, and then external with people who are also engaged in community building, whether that's nonprofit or government. And then some business leaders are kind of interested in this too, depending on how civically oriented they are. But yeah, I have copies. Come grab a handful if you wish. They're here and for you, because I don't want to lug them back home.
With that, we'll have our closing remarks from our panelists. If you have any last tidbits you want to share with the group before we close for lunch.
I'd just like to say, thank you all for having me out. You guys are more than welcome to, I've got business cards up here. You guys are more than welcome to reach out to me. We have a website you can find us on. It's uca.edu/ACRE, that's ACRE, and we have our research up there. We have our contacts on there. If there's anything you want to reach out to us about, we'd be happy to help you in any way we can. So thank you.
Oh, I'd say the same thing. I left business cards on the table out there, along with a little information sheet on what we do, and it's got our web address on there, ualr.edu/AEDI, and you're welcome to contact me anytime you've got issues, anytime you need something. Our kind of philosophy is, if we don't have it, we'll try to find you someone who does. So we never let people go away hungry.
It's a good philosophy.
Absolutely.
Not least.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add other than happy to visit about Aspire, data, grants, or anything that's on your mind.
Thank y'all so much. I'm sure you all can smell it now, so we'll break for lunch and networking. Thank y'all.